When the State Department tells American citizens to leave a country now and explicitly warns them not to expect help from their own government, I don't hear confidence. I hear institutional fear. I spent years inside the intelligence system, and I learned early that urgent public warnings are rarely about imminent tactical danger. They are about strategic uncertainty that policymakers no longer know how to manage quietly. The Leave Iran Now directive wasn't intelligence driven clarity, it was narrative damage control. The public justification was unrest, protests, communications, blackouts, reports of hundreds killed. None of that was new to anyone who actually follows Iran. What was new was Washington's sudden need to dramatize it. When intelligence is solid, governments act quietly. They evacuate selectively. They posture privately. They don't issue blunt, headline-ready commands unless they are trying to get ahead of a story they no longer control. Inside the system, protests like these are notoriously hard to assess. Casualty figures are fragmentary. Sources are politically motivated. Social media becomes an amplifier for claims that cannot be independently verified in real time. Any honest intelligence officer will tell you that early numbers coming out of closed societies are almost always wrong. But policymakers don't wait for confidence intervals. They wait for narratives that can be sold. What troubled me wasn't the warning itself. It was the framing around it. The administration publicly emphasized diplomacy while simultaneously advertising military options. That combination isn't deterrence. It's confusion. When intelligence assessments are coherent, messaging is disciplined. Here, the message was scattershot sanctions, escalation, tariff threats, regime change, rhetoric, and moral outrage, all bundled together. That tells me analysts were being asked not what is happening, but what story best justifies action. This is how intelligence becomes fiction, not through lies, but through selective amplification. You take worst-case assumptions, strip away uncertainty, and present them as settled fact. You turn unrest into imminent collapse. You turn warnings into proof of resolve. And in the process, you hollow out credibility. I watched this happen before in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. Each time, urgent warnings masked analytic doubt. Each time, policymakers confused signaling with strategy. And each time, intelligence professionals who raised caution were sidelined because caution doesn't headline well. The hard lesson is this. When a government tells its citizens it cannot help them, what it is really admitting is that it no longer trusts its own narrative control. That is not a strength. That is the sound of a strategic story coming apart. I've watched intelligence lose its center of gravity over the years, and it never happens all at once. It happens when analysis stops being the starting point and becomes a justification tool. In theory, intelligence informs policy. In practice, especially in moments like Iran, policy demands a message first and asks intelligence to retrofit the evidence. That is how assessments turn into talking points. When protests erupt inside a closed system like Iran, the first honest answer from any analyst should be, we don't know yet. We don't know scale, durability, command and control, or regime cohesion. Communications, blackouts distort everything. Opposition sources exaggerate momentum, regime sources minimize it. Signals intelligence provides fragments, not pictures. Human sources go silent or feed you what they think you want to hear. This is the fog where real intelligence work should slow down. Instead, Washington speeds up. What I saw repeatedly in my career was a subtle but deadly shift. Analysts stopped asking what the data supported and started asking what the policy narrative required. If the administration wanted leverage, unrest became unprecedented. If sanctions needed justification, economic pain became existential. If deterrence messaging was the goal, every protest was framed as a potential regime-ending moment. None of this required fabrication. It required selection. The media then completed the loop. Cable news amplified anonymous briefings. Numbers were repeated without sourcing. Words like collapse, desperation, and panic entered the vocabulary long before evidence did. Once that happens, intelligence agencies are no longer informing the public, they are managing expectations. And once expectations are set, walking them back becomes politically impossible. The State Department warning fit neatly into this cycle. It wasn't just about citizen safety, it was a narrative anchor. It told audiences something big and dangerous was happening, whether or not analysts could prove it. It created urgency where uncertainty still ruled. And urgency is useful. It suppresses skepticism. It sidelines inconvenient questions about what comes next. Inside the bureaucracy, this behavior is rewarded. Analysts who align with the prevailing narrative are seen as relevant. Those who emphasize uncertainty are labeled as obstacles. Over time, this produces a self-reinforcing culture where caution is equated with weakness and worst-case framing is mistaken for rigor. Intelligence doesn't fail because people are stupid. It fails because incentives are misaligned. The strategic consequence is devastating. Adversaries learn to discount American statements. Allies stop trusting assessments that swing wildly from alarm to amnesia. And policymakers begin to believe their own messaging. That is the most dangerous point when narrative replaces analysis, not just publicly, but internally. The hard lesson here is simple and brutal. The moment intelligence becomes messaging, it stops being intelligence. It becomes theater. And theaters collapse the moment reality walks on stage. Every time unrest erupts in a closed society, Washington reaches for numbers before it understands meaning. I've seen this pattern too many times to mistake it for an accident. Casualty figures appear early, spread fast, and harden into fact long before any serious verification occurs. In Iran, the same script played out again. Claims of hundreds killed circulated almost immediately, repeated across media and political briefings, with little distinction between confirmed deaths, estimates, rumors, or outright fabrication. Once a number is spoken by an official voice, it takes on a life of its own. From an intelligence perspective, early casualty figures out of Iran are among the least reliable data points imaginable. Communications blackouts sever independent reporting. Hospitals are monitored. Families are pressured into silence. Opposition networks inflate numbers to maintain momentum and attract foreign support. Regime sources undercount to project control. Signals intelligence can suggest the scale of unrest, not body counts. Human intelligence dries up precisely when violence escalates. Any analyst worth the title knows this. Yet the numbers still get pushed forward. Why? Because numbers create moral gravity. Dozens can be debated. Hundreds demand action. Once you cross the numerical threshold, policy conversations change. Sanctions feel justified. Military options sound responsible. Restraint begins to look like complicity. The narrative no longer revolves around uncertainty, but around urgency. That shift is not analytic, it is political. What troubled me was not that casualty claims were discussed, but that their provisional nature vanished in public discourse. Conditional language disappeared. Confidence grew without evidence. This is where intelligence culture fails. Instead of clearly labeling estimates as estimates, officials let ambiguity stand because ambiguity serves the message. And once the message is set, intelligence is pressured to catch up to it. The strategic consequence is distortion. Policymakers begin to plan around assumed realities rather than verified ones. They misjudge regime stability. They overestimate protest cohesion. They underestimate the regime's capacity for repression. This isn't theoretical. We watched it happen in Iraq in 1991, again in 2003, in Libya in 2011, and repeatedly in Syria. Each time, inflated expectations led to strategic disappointment and long-term instability. The numbers problem doesn't just mislead the public, it misleads decision makers themselves. Briefings become echo chambers where assumptions are reinforced instead of challenged. Analysts who question the figures are told they are missing the bigger picture. But the bigger picture is built from small facts. When those facts are shaky, the picture collapses under its own weight. The hard lesson is one, intelligence officers are supposed to internalize early. When numbers move faster than verification, you are no longer measuring reality. You are manufacturing consent. And once consent is built on fiction, the policy that follows will fail, no matter how forcefully it is sold. Sanctions have become Washington's most abused policy instrument because they feel like action without risk. I've watched them transform from a tool of pressure into a substitute for strategy. In the Iran case, sanctions were framed as decisive leverage, proof that economic pain would translate into political capitulation. That assumption was never grounded in solid intelligence. It was grounded in wishful thinking. Inside the intelligence community, the real assessment of sanctions is far more cautious than public rhetoric suggests. Economic stress does not automatically produce regime collapse. More often, it consolidates elite control, strengthens internal security services, and gives the regime a foreign enemy to blame. Iran has lived under sanctions for decades. Its leadership understands how to ration pain, shift burdens downward, and exploit nationalism when pressure mounts. None of this is speculative. It is a historical record. Yet in public, sanctions are sold as linear cause and effect. Increased pressure, unrest grows, regime weakens, policy succeeds. That narrative ignores countervailing intelligence, the resilience of security forces, the ideological commitment of core elites, and the regime's willingness to escalate repression when survival is threatened. These realities are known inside classified assessments. They are rarely emphasized outside them. The addition of secondary sanctions and tariff threats was presented as an escalation with a purpose. In reality, it was signaling layered on top of signaling. The message to domestic audiences was resolved. The message to allies was compliance. The message to Iran was ambiguous pressure without a clear off-ramp, punishment without defined end states. From an intelligence standpoint, that ambiguity is dangerous. Adversaries fill vacuums with worst-case assumptions. Sanctions also distort intelligence reporting itself. Analysts begin to look for evidence that sanctions are working. Protests become proof. Currency fluctuations become indicators of collapse. Intelligence becomes confirmation seeking rather than diagnostic. When analysts are subtly encouraged to demonstrate policy effectiveness, objectivity erodes. This is not corruption in the criminal sense, it is bureaucratic self-preservation. The strategic consequence is self-deception. Policymakers believe they are shaping outcomes when they are merely reacting to noise. They mistake pressure for control. Meanwhile, Iran adapts expanding regional proxies, hardening alliances, and internalizing economic isolation as the new normal. None of this shows up in press releases, but it shows up in long-term intelligence trends. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Sanctions do not replace strategy. They expose the absence of one. When economic punishment becomes the centerpiece of policy rather than a supporting tool, it signals not strength, but uncertainty about what comes next. And adversaries can smell uncertainty better than any intelligence service ever could. Whenever Washington starts talking about a wide range of options, I know strategy has already failed. I heard that phrase countless times inside briefing rooms, and it was almost always a tell. It meant there was no agreed end state, no coherent theory of victory, and no serious plan for what came after the use of force. Military options were being discussed not because they were necessary, but because they were familiar. In the Iranian context, the menu was predictable. Strikes on IRGC facilities, cyber operations, information warfare, covert support to opposition networks. Each option sounded decisive in isolation. None of them answered the central intelligence question. Then what? Removing assets does not remove intent. Disrupting networks does not dismantle regimes. And symbolic strikes rarely produce strategic compliance when survival is at stake. From an intelligence standpoint, Iran's security apparatus is built precisely to absorb punishment. The IRGC is not a single target set. It is a distributed political, military, economic network embedded across society. Limited strikes would harden it, not weaken it. Cyber operations might disrupt communications temporarily, but they would also justify broader repression. Delivering internet access to protesters sounds noble, but it assumes organizational capacity that intelligence has never conclusively demonstrated. The deeper problem is that militarized options become attractive when policymakers no longer trust non-military tools to deliver results. Sanctions plateau, diplomacy stalls, narratives lose credibility. At that point, force becomes a signaling device rather than a solution. Intelligence is then tasked with validating action rather than evaluating consequences. I saw this dynamic repeatedly. Analysts were asked to estimate Iranian responses to hypothetical strikes, but those estimates were framed narrowly retaliation timelines, proxy activity, and regional escalation. What was rarely asked was whether the action advanced a strategic objective at all. Tactical competence replaced strategic coherence. The danger is not accidental war. The danger is purposeless force. When military action lacks an end state, it creates momentum without direction. Adversaries adapt. Regional instability increases. Credibility erodes further when objectives quietly shift or disappear. Intelligence services then find themselves explaining outcomes they never believed in to begin with. This is how wars become habits. Each action justifies the next. Each failure is blamed on insufficient pressure rather than flawed assumptions. And intelligence, instead of breaking the cycle, is pressured to keep it moving. The hard lesson is one Washington still resists learning. Military options are not strategies, they are tools. When leaders reach for them without defining success, they reveal not resolve, but intellectual exhaustion. And intelligence professionals who don't push back at that moment become complicit in turning force into fiction. People like to imagine intelligence failure as the result of bad actors or political orders handed down from above. That explanation is comforting because it implies the system would work if only the right people were in charge. My experience tells a different story. The most dangerous distortions in intelligence come from incentives, not directives. They are baked into the bureaucracy. Inside the intelligence community, careers are built on relevance. Analysts who produce work that aligns with policy priorities are promoted. Those who raise persistent doubts are labeled non-constructive. This doesn't require anyone to falsify information. It requires them to emphasize some facts and quietly downplay others. Over time, this selection process shapes what senior leaders see and what they never hear. In Iran, the incentive structure was clear. Assessments that framed unrest as destabilizing were welcomed. Analyses that highlighted regime resilience were seen as pessimistic or unhelpful. Nobody said, make the regime look weak. The system did that on its own. Analysts learn quickly which judgments get briefed upstairs and which die at the desk level. This bureaucratic pressure also distorts collection. Resources flow towards sources and methods that reinforce the prevailing narrative. Contradictory reporting is treated as an anomaly rather than a signal to reassess assumptions. Once a storyline takes hold, intelligence stops exploring alternatives and starts refining the script. What makes this particularly dangerous is that senior policymakers often believe they are receiving the unfiltered truth. They aren't. They are receiving truth that has been shaped by multiple layers of institutional self-censorship. By the time information reaches the top, uncertainty has been smoothed out, and dissenting analysis has been sanitized. The media environment worsens this dynamic. Leaks reward analysts who support dominant narratives. Public attention reinforces internal consensus. When intelligence officials see their assessments echoed on television, it creates the illusion of validation. In reality, it's a feedback loop. The strategic consequence is groupthink with credentials. Decisions are made with confidence, unsupported by evidence. Failures are explained away as execution errors rather than analytic flaws. And when outcomes diverge from expectations, accountability evaporates because the narrative has already moved on. The hard lesson is one intelligence officers rarely admit out loud. Institutional incentives matter more than integrity slogans. If careers depend on telling leaders what they want to hear, then intelligence will eventually reflect desire rather than reality. No conspiracy is required. The system will lie to itself quite efficiently. The final cost of all this distortion is not measured in a single crisis or a single bad decision. It is measured in credibility, and once credibility is gone, it does not come back on command. From an intelligence perspective, this is the most damaging consequence of narrative-driven policy. Adversaries stop listening, allies start hedging, and American assessments, once treated as benchmarks, become just another opinion. In a multipolar world, intelligence credibility is power. It shapes coalition behavior, deterrence calculations, and crisis management. When U.S. warnings are consistently framed in absolutist language and repeatedly fail to match outcomes, foreign services adjust, they discount urgency, they assume exaggeration, they build independent analytic channels rather than relying on Washington. This is not hostility, it is an adaptation. Iran learned this long ago, so did Russia, China, and even close European partners. When American officials speak of imminent collapse, decisive leverage, or overwhelming options, experienced adversaries translate that language into what it usually means: internal disagreement, analytic uncertainty, and political pressure for action. The words lose deterrent value because they no longer convey precision. This erosion doesn't stay external, it corrodes internal decision making as well. Policymakers accustomed to narrative-driven intelligence begin to distrust their own agencies when predictions fail. They compensate by demanding certainty where none exists. Analysts respond by overstating confidence. The cycle tightens. Reality is squeezed out. The State Department warning to leave Iran was not catastrophic by itself. It was symptomatic. It reflected a system that no longer knows how to communicate uncertainty honestly. Everything must be urgent. Everything must be framed as decisive. There is no room left for ambiguity, even though ambiguity is the natural state of intelligence. The long-term strategic consequence is that American power becomes noisy but less effective. Threats are issued more frequently and taken less seriously. Assessments are broader and less trusted. Intelligence becomes reactive rather than anticipatory. In that environment, miscalculation becomes more likely, not less. The hard lesson at the end of this documentary is not ideological, it is professional. Intelligence does not exist to win arguments or justify policy. It exists to describe reality as it is, especially when that reality is inconvenient. When intelligence becomes fiction, policy follows it into failure, and when that happens repeatedly, the damage is not just to a single administration, it is to the country's ability to navigate a world that no longer grants it the benefit of the doubt.